In the past century, human beings have fundamentally changed our relationship with the planet, and it's all come about through growth. Growth in population, in technology, in consumption, in the global economy, and in the rise of cities, and it has been catastrophic. In the past 2 months alone, reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, from the journal Nature, from the United States government indicate that we are on a path that threatens our very survival as a species. Now remember, the greenhouse effect was first described by Joseph Fourier in 1824. For more than a century, scientists explored the implications of a warming planet. By the 1950s, Mikhail Boryko, a Russian climatologist, predicted that Arctic sea ice would begin to melt and accelerate global warming. In 1965, Frank Icard, president of the petroleum industry, sounded the alarm. I quote, "There is still time to save the world's people from the catastrophic consequence of pollution, but time is running out. Carbon dioxide is being added to the Earth's atmosphere by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas at a rate that by the year 2000, the heat balance will be so modified as to possibly cause changes in climate beyond local or even national efforts." In 1977, Exxon scientist James Black reported, "Mankind is influencing the global climate through carbon dioxide release from the burning of fossil fuels." And in 1982, Exxon's own scientists warned avoiding potentially catastrophic events would require major reductions in fossil fuel combustion. In 1988, the climatologist James Hansen testified before the US Congress and said the Earth was warming from human emissions of greenhouse gases. Yet 10 years later, in 1998, the American petroleum industry's position had changed to it's not known for sure if A, climate change is actually occurring, and B, if it is, whether humans really have an influence on it. Fossil fuel companies led by Exxon copied the tobacco industry by pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a campaign of disinformation, and it worked. Most Americans today do not believe that our use of fossil fuels is causing climate change. And so, except for 2008, general global emissions have kept on rising.
We often discuss the problem of populist fear-mongering, of right-wing extremism as increasing in relevance. And while it very well might, we shouldn't forget that this makes it sound as if it stopped being relevant. I would argue that it never did. Racism and different ways to justify domination of some people over others has long been part of the society that we built. It's been constructed and reconstructed and maintained over many, many years. Therefore, we won't find the solutions in the society of 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. The ingrainedness of these ideas became very clear to me when I spent over a year with far-right extremists in the alt-right in the US and the extreme right in the UK. Among them, this feeling of having one's entitlements stripped away, rights that are often described as natural, although they of course aren't and never were. It's a nostalgic feeling of longing back to something where actually some people were just living at the expense of others. But in these groups and by voting for these parties, we're made to feel like we are in control again. They have that effect on people. What I'm trying to say is that the rise now of the populist far right is not an anomaly. It's something that comes off the back of structures in society, and the feeling of change and the insecurity of the future of oneself and the economic situation of one's future. When you feel that your children might be worse off than yourself, you try to find ways of getting back into control, find simple solutions that we often define or talk about as very basic and simple, but actually are just taken in contrast to the bureaucratic society that we live in that feels natural and eternal even. And those are the feelings we need to oppose.
Gender equality, the word gender. Despite being multidimensional, I would like to point out that gender has its own definition, narrative, and concept. Unfortunately, in the world today, the concept of gender is misunderstood. I currently work in Kabul, Afghanistan, on women's empowerment issues. And what I often see is gender is synonymous for womanhood. That's a mistake. We need to know the problems before we look for solutions. Secondly, gender advocates tend to be women. Again, that can be problematic because women are not highlighters of gender equality issues. Today, at this all-male-dominated panel, I am not going to be a yellow marker representing gender equality. I am here as an agent to speak about a particular topic in order to find these solutions. Secondly, to be a woman and represent gender equality issues. It is very easy to have gender inequality issues fallen into your lap if you have visibility as a female gender, if you are in a position of power, and if you are in a decision-making position. Because it is very easy to say, she's also working with empowerment, but there's no concrete action plan in doing so. It is just symbolic. Thirdly, we have focused too much on the rights perspective when it comes to gender equality issues. So for instance, if we look into the most disadvantaged gender group in the world today, being women, we tend to say it is the woman's right to equal pay, especially in the Western world. That has been a huge debate. In my job in Afghanistan, lately I have been working a lot on women's right to be a part of the peace process. Currently, there's a conference simultaneously in Geneva, working with the Afghan government, United Nations, on women's participation in peace talks with the Taliban. It is a woman's right to be at the peace table is a discussion. I believe it's a mistake to talk about the woman's right to be at the peace table because we only create a supply for women to be there. We need to go beyond that and talk about the impact of gender equality, the impact of men and women having equal resources to power, equal resources to conversation, so that they can be there as agents of change rather than their gender. So it's not about 50% women and men, it is about the right agents in decision making.
Art as truth teller of history, yes, maybe, but also no. Art is a very powerful tool of communication. Art speaks to us on many different levels. It speaks to us on the intellectual level, on emotional, and even physical level. It speaks to the heart, speaks to the mind, speaks to our bodies. So art is a very powerful tool. And art has been used over the centuries by powerful people, not only to tell the truth, but also to manipulate, propaganda. And art can be used in all kinds of fashions as communications. Art has the power to change lives, to change human beings, to make ourselves understand more of ourselves, to make ourselves understand more of our relationships, understand more of the world. Art creates reflection, knowledge, and understanding. And that's why it has been used over the centuries to propose and to promote interest of powerful people. But there is a change happening. Around 1850, art is liberated from the powerful people and starts to be more critical. Artists are more liberated, and they start to work into social issues, political issues. And it goes into the exploration of human beings, goes into the cruelty of war, to the cynical use of soldiers, to poverty, to corruption, to social differences. And art is taking a critical point of view. So art is going to change the world, and art is in front of the population, in front of the political developments and policy making. So art is not only in front of what is happening, but the rest is behind. So I would say that the huge difference that we experience in the world after the First World War, when everything is turned upside down and the old empires is disappearing, and you have the huge revolution in Soviet Union, you have the revolution in China, wouldn't happen without the arts. The art was a very powerful tool in creating an understanding of the world as it was and the need for change, and art was certainly in the center of what was happening. And since then, art has been also critical and being on the liberal side of the development of the world and maintaining the values that we believe in today. And I think when we want to reinvent growth, we need to use art. Art will be there, art has the possibility, and art will make a difference. Art can make a sense of urgency and find solutions, and that's where art should be, and that's where it's going to be.
Let me start by sharing the story of Norsk Hydro, the company I work for. Founded in 1905 by two smart guys who wanted to solve one of the world's, at that time, largest challenges. There was not enough food to feed a rapidly growing world population. They wanted to tame the waterfalls in Norway and use that energy to create fertilizers that could fight hunger and at the same time create prosperity for thousands of workers here in Norway. Our founders succeeded with their vision, and today it lives on in Yara, as we have heard. But ever since those days, more than 100 years ago, using energy to build viable societies has been the purpose of Norsk Hydro, today as an aluminium producer. In 1905 or 1918, did a business leader consider the same things as today? For sure it was risk. It was profit potential. It took capital and competence to build viable businesses. But working conditions were tougher, and nature not always treated with a full respect. Today, that is still the case many places in the world. And the United Nations has pointed out that it cannot simply continue that way and has put forward 17 sustainability goals. Now, more than ever, the way we do business is extremely important. For Norsk Hydro, future development rests on innovation and sustainability. And sustainability builds on the three pillars: environment, society, and economy. Where these three pillars overlap, that is where we find the definition of sustainability. So where do I see the main challenges for sustainable business today, 100 years after our company was founded? The energy matrix has to change. Green energy, being it hydropower, solar or wind, has won the hearts of so many of us. It must also win the cost race for all of us. Energy is the key component in any society and in our business. We should really embrace the speed of technology development and ensure that it's implemented as fast as possible to sort out the climate challenge. I hope that when future generations gather in 100 years from now for a conference where they look at business, they will some remember the crossroad in around 2020 when world business leaders took bold moves where innovation and sustainability met, and the exchange was remembered as a production platform for new great ideas. Thank you.
Almost 1 century ago, Mussolini was appointed as a prime minister, and joined by the black shirts, he imposed fascism. And 13 years later, Hitler arrived to power through legal means, and he imposed terror and genocide. And we passed almost 100 years believing that we were strengthening democracy and the rule of law. That democracy was able to satisfy the people's expectations. But what is happening is that, contrary to what we believed, that democracy was going to stay there forever, democracy is being eroded day after day in several places, several countries, because we trend to think that democracy could die in the hands of men with guns. But democracy may die not by generals, but by elected leaders. And actually, there is not like a breaking point, like a crossing line when democracy dies. They are eroding democracy step by step, and those steps are not evident. They are canceling liberties. They are threatening the press. They are doing things that are not so evident. And in several places, suddenly we realize, well, we lost freedom and liberties. And this is the case on my own continent, in Venezuela or Nicaragua, a long time ago, Cuba. But now, curiously, where we consider one of the oldest and the most successful democracy in the US, politicians are saying and doing things that are unprecedented. They are treating their rivals like enemies of the nations. They are threatening the free press. They are destroying the credibility of the people. They are weakening institutions, the Supreme Court, the intelligence services, the environmental agencies. Democracy needs to be protected 100 years after. Democracy needs citizens. Democracy needs participation. Because now, extreme polarization is destroying and killing democracy. And we need to stop that.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Like Churchill said, democracy is mainly a process. So how do we get an inclusive democracy in the world today?
We need to understand that inclusion is part of the essence of democracy. Because without inclusion, we start to cancel the idea of different people from us. Inclusion requires active and specific public policy that bring it out to equal rights to get access to education, equal rights to get access to health services, equal rights to get access to political representation, equal access to power. And inclusion is the only way in which we can avoid the extreme polarization, which is beyond the political difference. Extreme polarization, it's about an existential war between human beings related to gender, related to race, related to social conditions, related to color of the people. So we need to understand that democracy cannot live without inclusion.
So how do we go beyond law and policy and look into concrete action plan? And for instance, including gender when it comes to democratic process and their access to decision-making and power?
I believe that we need to establish exactly active policies. But let me ask you the other way around. In your own experience, in such a difficult situation like living in Afghanistan, and with some cultures, actually public policies are oppressing, gender issues are oppressing the women, what are exactly the ways in which we can take action in order to prevent that, in order to improve democratic conditions?
I think the solution to that is basically looking into an entire ecosystem. Because one thing is what the government is doing from their side, and policy making and lawmaking. The other side is what happens in the society, in the societal expectations towards gender equality participation. Families, norms, cultures, religion. This will take a very, very long time to change, of course. But we have to look into the entire system. Like, I'm sure the same system applies to any other country in the world, like Mexico as well. There's stereotyping towards what a woman should be and what a man should be.
But the point is, how can we change the culture? How can we stop the governments and stop the parents and stop the classmates to take such kind of performance, such kind of behavior? So I believe we all together can contribute to change that culture, and that is exactly what Exchange is about.
I completely agree with you. At the same time, I also think we need to talk about a model that is good for all, but contextualize in the societies and the communities that this model needs to be applied to. So it needs to grow from the inside with a little push from the outside in order to have an organic development in this field, in order to have sustainability when it comes to this field. So it can't be something created in a different continent and sort of just implied on the ground. And I see it in my work every day, where we have international interventions that are trying to change the structures in the society, but the model needs to grow from within with a little bit of help from the outside.
Definitely, yes. But we need to remember that democracy needs to be built on a daily basis. Don't take democracy for granted. Don't believe that your own freedom and then your own democratic conditions in your own country, even a very developed country, is going to be there forever. You need to be a Democrat and an active citizen to protect democracy.
How do we regain the values of democracy that we have in the world today? How do we go back to those values and try to maintain it so that it doesn't disappear from our hands with the current model we have today?
We need to learn every single day how can we be even better Democrats. And I'm sure you have the answer related with what is the way to understand that women are exactly equal than any other one.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you how you think that art and art institutions, like your own museum, can stay relevant in a society that is marked by division and increasing differences and lack of contact between groups and communities of people.
I think artists and art institutions really need to participate in solving society's most important questions and problems. And I agree with Felipe that today we really need to protect freedom of speech, human rights, and democracy. And I also think that what happens today is very interesting, actually, because there's a lot of investment in infrastructure in the arts. There is 300 museums opens, new museums opens in China every year. There is 50 new opera houses happening now in Europe. It's a huge investment. At the same time, art is under a strong pressure because there is a lot of art today that are not given any space to express itself. And that is not only happening in totalitarian regimes that are afraid of the arts and of freedom of speech, but it also happens in the Western democracies. For example, every day we see that art is suppressed in the United States. We see art is suppressed in the Western part of Europe. So we are under very high pressure. But I think the question of relevance is very important. I think we need to be relevant, and we need to be relevant to more people, and a lot of the people that feel left outside today. And that's when we see the diversity of society. What happens today when democracy is under threat is that a lot of people feel left outside. And how can we actually be more relevant to the people that you were discussing earlier, that feel outside, and go to more, let's say, go to more fundamental ways of changing society.
Okay. And do you see an issue with, again, institutions, museums, all these museums being under financial pressure? In many cases, there's a lack of funding from public means, so you have to ask for ticket prices and that sort of thing to finance. And that, do you see an issue with that driving a focus on groups in society that can pay for art, and how do you include the people that can't?
No, I think it's a very good thing that we have the financial sources from not only public but also private sources. I think that actually creates a possibility to reach out to the rest of society in many ways. So that's a good thing, in fact. But I also think that we have this strange thing happening now, that art is actually has a very high legitimacy, higher than political environment, higher than media. So we have the possibility to use that power to try to make changes in a very positive way. And again, we have to protect the values that we believe in. But at the same time, I think we have a big challenge in trying to find out what is actually happening right now. How can we describe what is happening? How can we make people feel more unafraid of the big changes that is coming through digitalization and globalization? And I also like to point out that art is losing ground somehow, because art is publicly funded, basically, in the Western European societies anyway. And now we see that we don't have any funding for the digitalization. So the digital world, we are not part of that at the moment. A lot of the people growing up today, like the Z generation born after 1997, spends more than 50% of their lives on the digital platforms. And the art institutions and the art is not there. So that's also part of a very big challenge that we are facing right now. So I think we have to represent a larger part of society. And I think when 60% of the population doesn't relate to art, it doesn't visit art institutions, it doesn't have any relationship to art, then we really need to look into that and see what we can do to be more relevant.
Thank you.
Sustainability, you know, is a very recent word that we keep using in the business world. How did it come to be incorporated into the idea of Norsk Hydro so early?
Well, I think it is, actually you have to go back to 1905 when the company was founded, because when we tamed the waterfalls, they were not in urban areas, you know, they were far out in the countryside. So there was no people there, or at least very few. So actually, to create a business at all, you had to build the cities, you had to build the schools, you had to build the churches, you know, you had to make it livable for people. So in a way, you had to create a sustainable local society. So I think it started all back there, that, you know, we didn't call it sustainability. We were not around in 1905, but I don't think they called it sustainability, but they said, we need to do this to make this a livable place. I think
so you tried to build something close to the source of energy,
yeah,
rather than transport that energy through lines to where it was needed.
Exactly. So it, you know, today we talk a lot about, let's say, the cost of this and that, and I think at that time there was no alternative to use it locally. But they did it in a way that I would say it created it created prosperity, it created business potential for those who own the company, but it created a lot of wealth for the society. And I think that, you know, Norway was founded as an independent country in 1905, and Hydro is the same. And, you know, we have grown this country together as I would say, a special model, and you know the Norwegian model is in a way, I think, is more based on a sustainable thinking than many other places in the world.
The problem that I see is that corporations are really built on the need for profit. The more, the sooner, the better. And as you know, steady growth indefinitely is what cancer cells believe in as well. When you live in a finite world, you can't grow indefinitely. No. And this is what the real crisis that we face now.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think you, just for how we think about this, I think that, you know, when the consciousness around what do we do to nature started, let's say, decades ago, you start to do something with the production methods. Huh? You cleaned up the production methods, and now we have to clean up even more and use clean energy. Now we're much more focused on What is happening when, for example, our material is in use? Is it to the benefit of society? Do we get lighter cars so that they use less fuel, etc.? But we also have to take care of the metal when it's finished in use. So we are much more focused now on the circular economy. So that's where I think also all corporations need to spend more time to think about not only producing something, but the whole life cycle, from cradle to grave, and so on and so on. So on the limits of nature, circular economy needs to be much more critical for the future.
The other problem that I see as a scientist is that we can invent or come up with very powerful ideas, but we don't see the bigger context within which those ideas will be practiced. When DDT was sprayed on farmers' fields, the inventor, Paul Muller, won a Nobel Prize for it, but we didn't know there was a thing called biomagnification, concentration up the food chain. And that happens over and over again. We're so clever, but we don't see the bigger picture.
But isn't that strange? Because today, in the split of a second, we can get all the information in the world. Why do we not connect better? Do you have an answer to that?
Even with all, well, what I find is, and I had a career in television because I thought that Canadians needed to know about the most powerful force shaping their lives, which is science. And we were scientifically illiterate. So I thought if I give more information, they'll make better decisions. Turns out to be absolutely wrong. People now have more information in a cell phone than people ever had in human history. But what they do is they just go through that until they find something they already believe that supports them. So they don't have to change their mind. And this is the problem.
This is critical. And I think that we as business leaders, we need to create trust that we need to change together. That is also part of what we should discuss today and tomorrow.